When you hear the name IMF, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
IMF.
IMF.
For me, one number always stands out. $1.4 trillion. That's how much money developing countries spent in 2023 just to service their foreign debt. And let me be clear, this isn't even the debt itself. This is only the interest. The principal hasn't even been touched. Over $1 trillion gone. Money that could have built schools, roads, and hospitals instead disappeared into polished offices in Washington, London, and Paris. Now, of course, when a loan is given, repayments make sense. That part isn't controversial. But this story doesn't end there. For every single dollar of aid sent to the global south, $14 flow back out through underpriced exports, overpriced imports, and profits repatriated by foreign investors. Over the past 60 years, an estimated $62 trillion has been extracted from developing nations and transferred straight into banks and corporations in wealthy countries. And standing at the center of this entire system is the International Monetary Fund, often described as the world's financial firefighter, but in reality, acting more like a global debt enforcer. We're told the IMF exists as a last resort, stepping in to save countries from economic collapse. But in practice, it ties nations to harsh austerity programs, forcing them to trade sovereignty for survival. According to the United Nations, developing countries now carry over $31 trillion in debt. On the surface, that number doesn't look shocking when you compare it to the United States, whose debt alone exceeds $38 trillion. But here's the key difference. The US gets breathing room. Developing countries don't. No matter how much aid they receive, no matter how many reforms they implement, the debt becomes harder to manage, and life becomes more difficult for ordinary people. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries are facing debt distress. In simple terms, that means governments are struggling just to keep up with their repayments. The scale of the problem is staggering. Many countries now spend more money paying interest than they do on actual development. And the cycle keeps repeating. A country runs out of cash, the IMF steps in, promises stability, and offers a bailout. But every bailout comes with a detailed manual on how that country must run its economy. When you look at the numbers, the results are troubling. Independent evaluations show that countries under IMF programs grow far less than expected. On average, economic growth in the first year falls 1.5 percentage points below IMF projections. That's not a minor miscalculation. That's entire economies slowing down when they were supposed to recover.
Then there's the question of power. Out of nearly 190 member nations, one country, the United States, holds veto power over major IMF decisions. Altogether, the global North controls 9 times more voting power than the global South combined. So while the IMF presents itself as a global institution, in reality, it operates like a boardroom dominated by the world's richest economies. And honestly, that starts to sound a lot like colonialism, just with a modern financial disguise. Now, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and check out the newsletter. But let's get back to the bigger picture. Colonialism never truly disappeared, it simply evolved. Instead of armies and flags, modern control is enforced through debt, high interest rates, and economic policies written thousands of miles away. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the moment when nations finally broke free from colonial rule, only to find themselves trapped in a completely new kind of struggle. By the mid-20th century, the world was holding its breath. After decades of war, exploitation, and colonial rule, independence finally seemed within reach. Between 1945 and 1960, countries across Asia and Africa broke free from European empires. Flags were raised, anthems were written, and nations were officially born. But freedom on paper didn't repair what centuries of extraction had destroyed. The borders these new nations inherited were often random lines drawn in distant European offices. Tribes were split apart. Historical rivals were forced together. Economies were hollowed out long before independence ever arrived. When freedom finally came, many of these countries had nothing solid to build on. No industrial base, no infrastructure, no access to capital. Supporters of colonialism often argue that colonial powers invested in infrastructure, railways, roads, ports. What they leave out is where those railways actually went. Most led straight to ports, not to cities or local markets. They weren't built to develop countries, they were built to extract resources efficiently. So when colonizers left, they didn't leave prosperity behind. They left debt, division, and fragile economies. And that raised an obvious question. What do you do when your country is broke before it even begins? You borrow. That's exactly what many newly independent nations did, and this is where the IMF enters the story. The IMF was created in 1944 when delegates from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The goal was ambitious: rebuild the post-war world and design a global financial system that could prevent another economic collapse like the Great Depression. Out of that meeting came two powerful institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. One of the key architects behind this system was Harry Dexter White. His story is often overlooked, but it matters. He was born into a poor immigrant family and didn't attend college until his 30s. Through sheer talent, he rose through Harvard and into the US Treasury, becoming one of the most influential economists of his era. At Bretton Woods, White helped design a system that would shape the global economy for generations. And to be fair, the IMF did begin with good intentions. Its original mission was simple: provide short-term loans to countries facing temporary balance of payments problems. If a nation's currency collapsed or imports exceeded exports, the IMF would step in to stabilize the situation. The key word was temporary. These loans were supposed to buy time, to give nations space to breathe, recover, and move forward. But history has a way of stretching temporary into decades. By the 1970s, the global economy was shaken. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system, combined with oil price shocks, sent shockwaves across developing economies. Countries borrowed heavily just to stay afloat. By the 1980s, debt levels had exploded. What began as a liquidity problem turned into a full-scale debt crisis. From Latin America to Eastern Europe, economies started collapsing one after another. Once again, the IMF stepped in, this time with a very different approach. The new loans came with conditions far more severe than anything before. They were called Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAPs. On paper, these programs promised stability and reform. In reality, they delivered submission. Countries were pulled into a cycle of dependence. Each loan came with new conditions. Each condition tightened external control. Governments began shaping their budgets around IMF requirements rather than their own citizens' needs. This was the birth of what many critics call the IMF debt trap, a system where once a country enters IMF oversight, it struggles to ever fully escape it. Structural adjustment became a rigid checklist. To qualify for IMF or World Bank funds, governments were told to devalue their currency, cut public spending, privatize state-owned industries, open markets to foreign investors, remove protections for local businesses. Even tax systems were redesigned to reassure lenders that repayments would come first. On paper, some economies showed growth. Charts looked positive, but on the ground, the reality was very different. Factories shut down, jobs disappeared, local businesses couldn't compete with cheap imports flooding the market. Exports increased, but mostly in raw materials and low-value goods. The profits rarely stayed in the country. Meanwhile, luxury imports filled city storefronts, while unemployment rose and wages fell. It was a strange kind of prosperity, one that existed only in spreadsheets. The real winners were a small circle of local elites, foreign investors, and multinational corporations who bought up newly privatized assets at bargain prices.
As criticism grew, the IMF didn't abandon the system, it simply rebranded it. Structural adjustment evolved into something called conditionality, a softer word, but the same control. At first, conditionality sounded reasonable. The IMF claimed it was necessary to protect its funds and guide countries out of crisis. But over time, the conditions became even harsher. To access loans, countries had to slash social spending, raise taxes, remove subsidies, privatize industries, and open their economies even further. Once a deal was signed, there was no room to negotiate. Miss a target, and the next loan installment was frozen, risking economic collapse. That's how the IMF gained control over entire nations. With every new condition, IMF control only deepened. Governments were forced to redesign their entire economies just to keep the money flowing. Structural reforms pushed unemployment higher, government revenues lower, and the cost of basic services through the roof. Tax systems, pensions, and social security programs were reshaped, not to serve people, but to serve creditors. Rights were sidelined, inequality expanded, poverty spread. And in every IMF-backed economy, it was the poorest who paid the heaviest price. Cuts to public services were often the first step. Healthcare budgets were slashed, education funding was reduced. Entire generations grew up under austerity, less educated, less healthy, and less capable of building the very economies the IMF claimed it was saving.
The damage shows up clearly in the numbers. Take Zambia as an example. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments rose from 20% to 38% of the national budget. During the same period, healthcare spending fell from 9.5% to 8%, while education funding dropped from 17% in 2016 to just 12% in 2022. That's what happens when debt becomes the priority. The more governments pay creditors, the less they can invest in their own people. Over time, the IMF experienced what economists call mission creep. What started as short-term financial assistance turned into long-term control. The IMF now influences how countries write laws, structure taxes, privatize industries, and regulate banking systems. Each loan comes with a checklist. Each checked box means less sovereignty. Nowhere has this been more visible than in Africa. These reforms were sold as a path to prosperity. Instead, they left many economies gasping for air. In absolute numbers, nearly twice as many Africans live in poverty today than decades ago. Between 1979 and 1992, Africa's GDP grew by less than 1%. 13 years of reforms, with almost nothing to show for it. Investment collapsed. Factories closed. Africa's share of global exports was cut by more than half. Agricultural exports fell from over 20% of the developing world's total to just 8%. Manufacturing exports dropped from nearly 8% to barely 1%. Markets reopened, but not for local growth. Foreign corporations walked in and bought ports, utilities, energy systems, and mineral rights. Wealth flowed outward, not inward. Today, around $88.6 billion leaves Africa every single year, nearly 4% of the continent's GDP, through illicit financial flows. That money could have built roads, hospitals, and schools. Instead, it disappears offshore. And this capital flight only makes governments more dependent on loans, tightening the IMF's grip even further. The pattern repeats. Meet fiscal targets, balance budgets, pay debt on time. When revenue falls short, spending is cut. First healthcare, then education, then social safety nets. Austerity balances spreadsheets, but drains economies of life. And this system wasn't designed for Africa's benefit. It was built to protect Western creditors and foreign investors. Even the IMF's leadership reflects that reality. For more than 65 years, the IMF has always been led by someone from industrialized Europe. But the model didn't stay confined to the global south. Once the system proved profitable, it was exported elsewhere. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the IMF-backed formula was rebranded as shock therapy. In 1992, Russia flipped the switch overnight. Prices were deregulated, industries were privatized, government spending was slashed. The result was one of the fastest economic collapses in modern history. Prices exploded while wages remained frozen. Life savings evaporated, poverty surged, crime rose, life expectancy dropped sharply. Factories that once employed millions shut down, and as the economy burned, a small group of men got rich buying oil, gas, steel, and banks for pennies on the dollar. That's how oligarchs were born. The same playbook appeared elsewhere. In Zambia, IMF pressure led to the privatization of copper mines, the country's economic lifeline. Promises of efficiency turned into unemployment, lost revenue, and foreign control. Multinational corporations moved in with tax exemptions while profits flowed overseas. In Argentina, IMF-backed privatization fueled short-term growth until the system collapsed in 2001. Banks froze accounts, the currency imploded, millions were pushed into poverty under IMF supervision. Again and again, the same pattern repeated across continents. We're told the IMF is a global safety net, a lender of last resort designed to stabilize economies. Economists and politicians repeat that line constantly, but history tells a different story. The IMF has never been just about fixing budgets. It's part of a broader system designed to protect the interests of the world's most powerful nations. So, when the IMF talks about reform and stability, we have to ask, is it really about saving economies or about safeguarding those who already control them? If you made it this far, drop an Earth or globe in the comments. And if you want to go deeper, check out my video on Russian oligarchs. I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.